I used to live in a haunted home for 7 years. The house was 2 stories, the ground level and then the basement level of equal size. In the basement, we had my room and my brother's room, as well as the furnace room and the living room. It started simple. When you'd be downstairs, you would hear people running up and down the stairs and walking on the wood floors above you, vice versa. After a while in my room and the furnace room, we began to see these little figures. They were black, and you could kind of see their eyes, but not really. They would begin to move things. Sometimes junk would move on its own. These were always more darker than the backgrounds that they are in. As if that wasn't bad enough, we started to see tall human-like figures that were the darkest of dark. We called them shadow figures. In a pitch black room, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, but you could see a shadow figure. They started showing up in the yard and trees, and they didn't really come into the house much after that. Eventually, our lives took a turn for the worse with legal issues regarding my grandfather who came to live with us. He was never a good guy. He used to beat his wife and kids and stole from everybody. He never took care of anyone. He had his own demon that followed him too, but I don't know if you want to hear about that. Anyway, when he showed up, he slept in the basement living room. He would pray on a regular basis for God to kill all of us, because he believed that we were bad people. When he showed up, the shadow figures seemed to follow him. They began standing in my doorway and watching me all night long, so I'd have to close and lock my door. Unlike the smaller creatures, the shadow figures given a harmful vibe. They eventually started entering rooms. My brother's was their favourite. They never went upstairs or crossed my room's doorway. But they did love my brother's room. They would stand at the end of his bed and watch him sleep. One night things got much worse. My grandfather was asleep in his bed, and I decided to put saran wrap over my brother's doorway to play a trick on him. It took me a fair while to set it all up. I decided to stand back and appreciate my work when I saw that there were 3 huge cuts down the middle of it. So I took it down and tried again, but once again they appeared. I decided to give it one more shot, and as I wrapped it up, I began feeling the tearing in front of me. I mean really slowly, like somebody was cutting it. I decided that I was going to wake up my brother and show him. As we turned the corner, we were stood face to face with one of these shadow figures. It was standing in the room with all the lights on, and it just turned around to look at us. I mean, it didn't have any facial features or anything, but you could tell what way it was looking. We ran into my brother's room to hide. We laid there for a good while when we could hear in the other room things being thrown around. After a few hours, we eventually managed to fall asleep. After this, the figures messed with my brother a lot more. I believe it is because we turned the corner, but my brother was face to face with one, and that's the one that looked at him. They actually started to attack him too after this. My brother had a friend over, and my brother took a swing at one of the imps and it disappeared, but when they woke up, they had bruises all up and down their backs. Now probably the worst thing that happened in that house was my brother was woken up randomly in the night by one. It was standing at the foot of his bed, and it screamed at him to get out now. This is the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me. Here's a little background first. I'm not very religious, but I do believe that there are spirits out there, and there's things that we can't explain. I'm currently 23, and this happened when I was 16. It was me, my mum, my stepdad, and my 2 sisters. My older sister was 13, and my youngest was 10. My parents were building their dream home, and we were all living in an apartment while the house was being built. The apartment complex was really nice and in a great area. I remember the day we moved into the apartment. We were all unpacking boxes and trying to get everything organised. What really stood out to me about the apartment was how white the carpet was. Now the whole apartment was carpeted except for the kitchen and bathrooms. So anyway, about 2 weeks later, we were all settled and unpacking. The day went on as usual. I remembered it's time for bed, and my older sister didn't want to go. She kept coming up with excuses to stay up. I never really thought anything from it, and eventually my mum made her go to her room. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of something rattling. It was coming from my sister's room. I eased out of bed and slowly walked into my sister's room. I opened the door and the noise stopped. Maybe I'm just hearing things, I thought. I then remembered walking back to my room and how cold it was. It was the middle of summer, and in the south it's at least 90 degrees or something at night. Our thermostat even read 64 when the air was set on 70. I shrugged it off and went back to bed though. The next day I went out with my girlfriend, who is now my wife. I left at about 11 PM and didn't return home until midnight. I got dropped off back home and went to unlock the apartment door. I then saw my sister sitting on the couch. She said, "Hey, when did you go outside?" I was confused. I said, "I just got home. I've been out all day." She looked at me as pale as a ghost. She said, "Eric, that's impossible. I just talked to you in your room." I just stood up and said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Yeah, you were just sitting in your room." Staring into the dark closet, I asked you what you were doing and you said nothing, so I left you to it. Now this really scared me, but I didn't show it. I just told my sister to stop messing around with me and I went into my room. When I opened my door, the closet was open and the light was off. I just turned on the TV and finally went to sleep at about 3 AM. A couple of weeks passed and one night my sister and I are out playing Nintendo Wii. It was around midnight by this point. She went to the kitchen and filled up a glass of Dr. Pepper. She walked out to the kitchen and stopped. She dropped the Dr. Pepper everywhere on the solid white carpet. She started staring down the hallway right behind me. What the hell? Why did you do that? Mum's gonna kill you, I said to her. She never said a word. She turned around and looked at me and said, "Eric, look over your shoulder, there's a man." At that very moment, my blood ran cold. I was overcome with dread. I could sense something was there. I turned around. There was nothing. I knew she wasn't lying because I felt it too. We cleaned up the soda and both went to sleep in the living room with the light on. My sister then told me that when she would take a shower, the mirrors would fog up and she would see a little girl writing something on the mirror. She thought it said "help me." "I'm okay, you convinced me the other night, but I'm not that gullible," I said. My sister didn't smile or anything. She was the most serious that I've ever seen her. This really scared me. A few days later, my parents had a funeral they had to attend and took both my sisters with them. I had the whole place to myself. I invited my girlfriend over, but told her to wait until I got out of the shower. I hop in the shower and about 10 minutes in, the lights dimmed a little. I felt this dread, like I felt the other night. I could see this man now. He had grey skin, a black beard and bright red eyes. I could see him in the corner of my eye. I got so scared that I just turned the shower off. I still had the soap in my hair and everything. I grabbed the towel and wiped the soap from my eyes. I swear to you, when I looked in the mirror, I could see the words "help me" written across it. I got dressed, called my girlfriend and demanded she come in now. I tried to explain everything to her as quickly as possible. She wasn't superstitious. She thought I was trying to scare her. I didn't want to go home that night, but my parents gave me no choice after what happened. That night, I tossed and turned trying to go to sleep. It was not working. I was wide awake thinking about what happened the day earlier. As I laid in bed, I heard the rattling noise coming from my sister's room. I got out of bed and opened her door, but this time the rattling continued. It was coming from her closet. I opened the closet and there was a shattered mirror laying on the ground. I remembered I put that mirror there when we had moved in, but it wasn't broken. How could it have broken? Even if it fell, it would have landed on the carpet. It weighed about 2 pounds, so it wouldn't have been enough to break it anyway, even if it had fallen. I woke my sister up and told her what was going on. She told me that she had been hearing the same noise for the past month. She was too afraid to investigate. Everything kind of calmed down after that. The day finally came, the day we moved out of that terrible apartment and into our new home. I remembered how happy I was packing up our stuff. We got everything locked into a U-Haul and left, not wanting to look back. I specifically put all of my electronics in a box by itself. We got to the new home and my phone was almost dead. I got to that box and started looking for my phone charger. I then remembered that my sister was using it when we were unpacking. Damn it, I asked my girlfriend to bring me back to the apartment to get my phone charger. This was going to be the first time that she had seen the apartment. I opened the door and she had a blank expression. She told me to get the charger so we could get out of here. I was just as ready as she was to leave. I remember to this day the coldness you felt when you walked in that place. I'm just thankful that I don't have to ever go back there again. I lived in a home with 4 girls and 4 animals in college. One night I happened to have the home to myself. This was fabulous because I had a paper to write. So I'm in my bed with my laptop and I hear a scratching at the door. It's the dog Miko and he's shaking and whining. As soon as I open the door, the 2 cats Ralph and Beena jump in behind him and jump on my bed. I squeeze in between all of them as I resume my studying. Suddenly, Ralph's hair stands on end and Miko starts to whine. Bernard's claws are digging into my legs as soon as I hear footsteps upstairs in the hallway. It's a pretty short hallway, probably about 20 feet, but the footsteps keep going. Now they're going past where the outer wall of the house is, into the neighbour's house. Miko starts growling when the footsteps turn around, and I hear them sprinting back in our direction. Then I hear a door slam shut. By this point my heart is racing, and Miko is barking up a storm, so I grab my baseball bat and run upstairs. When I get up there, I find absolutely no one. I had a real estate license, just to help family members. I created their website, travelled on location to take pictures before possible listing. I was a tech guru. Basically, I maintained and knew the equipment. There was this one piece of property. The only thing I was told before travelling with them was that the landowner had died and the family decided to sell the home. While I was attempting to photograph the property, with the adjoining field that contained a cemetery, I experienced all kinds of equipment failure. I knew it had fresh batteries and many media cards. I switched batteries several times along with media cards, but it all refused to work. The screen kept on reporting a camera failure or that the file wouldn't save. It was so frustrating. Now I decided that my only option was to rapid fire snapshots, no matter how many times the camera shut down. My 2 tag team member relator relatives rented a car and announced that they were leaving. It was a matter of fact statement. They were struck by silence. I said okay as we climbed into the vehicle, breaking the silence. No real estate banter as normal. As we were driving back and reached the bottom of the hill, I thought to ask if the property was being listed, and if so, offered to go back myself to take some proper photos. They told me that the family wanted to sell, but they were conflicted because as the elderly man was dying, he told them that if they attempted to sell the homestead, he would return to haunt them. Something happened there that they aren't telling me. Once home, I took the media card out and transferred all the images to my computer. Now there was literally only 2 images that I actually saved from my forensic session. One of them missed above an upright gravestone, and in another, there was a black figure in the tree line of the property. That's where the horses had been spooked earlier. It was dark, in a long coat, translucent, had horns on top of its head. Yep, I'm glad it wasn't listed, or at least not by our team. Apparitions, spirit, energy, whatever you want to call it. This ended up following me on a regular basis. Friends of mine told me it was a gift, but I'm not going to accept that. I actually quit the job since, and I've never took up photos again. Today, I shudder every time when I'm posing for a photo, scared that it's going to appear again. I grew up in a house that was haunted. We no longer live there, but my parents owned it for at least 15 years. Growing up, you would hear and see a number of things that were definitely not explainable. I once heard heavy footsteps walking around my house while I was in bed, only to have them stop on my door, and then it went dead silence. Multiple people unknown to each other saw a small boy walking in and out of a particular bedroom. Multiple different people saw a man wandering through the house throughout the years. My brother actually put his hand through him in fear and defense. After, he woke up another night to see him watching him sleep. There are some examples of what we dealt with. One day while I was driving home, I noticed an elderly neighbour working on a garden and decided to stop and ask her some questions, mostly about who lived there before and if they heard of anything. She mentioned that she'd been in the neighbourhood for 60 years but never knew who lived there because nobody ever lasted more than a couple of months. The original owners rented it for decades and no one would last after. She mentioned she was surprised my family had been there for so long. I did not believe in ghosts. Sure, I was entertained by the notion, but anybody who come out and stated that they believed in ghosts is dismissed as a new age hippie or whatever. Then I lived in a haunted house. It started out as little things. The bathroom door would open violently if anybody ever closed the latch. It was so often that we could count on it happening. I asked my roommate if he ever noticed a red light in the spare room when walking up the stairs in the dark. He did. I'd always go to the spare room to investigate, but could never find the source of it. These things I could explain away. The weirder things started to happen later on though. So during one night, I was sitting in the living room with my girlfriend and roommate when I noticed the shape of a woman's face on the window. We all noticed this. I tried to explain it away as a trick of the light. What finally convinced me that something was happening was one time when I was brushing my teeth. As I stood in the middle of my bathroom, something began tugging at me. There was nothing around or any source for this. Still, stranger things started happening. We'd hear footsteps upstairs while alone. I often saw shadows out of the corner of my eye. One time, I even saw a shadow while looking at it. Now, twice did I see this heading up the stairs to my room for bed. I would sometimes hear a woman's voice say goodnight to me over my shoulder. The strangest thing that happened was on New Year's Eve 3 years ago. My roommate and I were hosting a party and waiting for people to show up. Sitting in the living room, I suddenly felt something brush against my arm. The light bulb in the lamp went out. There's a few other things that happened and some I've forgotten about, but I'm sure as hell that none of these can just be coincidences. I've since moved out of the home, but my belief remains. Some strange things were happening there. My boyfriend and I decided to check out an open house in the neighbourhood that we wanted to live in. The apartment was everything we wanted. While my boyfriend talked to the landlord, I walked around alone, mentally decorating. I went to the bedroom, and there was a closet that took up one side of the entire wall. I stood in the middle of the room with an open window to my left that let in a lot of light. Curious as to how much space there was, I went up to the door and put my hand on the handle, and an image instantly flashed in my head. Have you ever been so engrossed in a daydream that you start staring off into open space, not really looking at what's in front of you? That's what it was like from the very second that I touched on the door. I then saw a man from the waist up, drenched in blood. He had no features and was barely recognizable as a person. I mean, he was completely skinned. I was only seeing muscle. I gasped and let go of the door, shaking it off as I opened the second pair of doors instead. There was nothing inside, but I said hello to the empty room. I then walked back to the living room. My boyfriend was talking to the elderly landlord, but I didn't listen to a word. I then looked down the hallway to the bedroom, and even though I couldn't physically see anyone there, I felt like there was a man standing in the hallway. He wasn't angry or happy. All I sensed was that he was curious. I felt he was curious about this person and why they were there. I wasn't curious about him though, and I didn't feel comfortable there. My boyfriend, however, was so thrilled with the place. I just didn't tell him right away what happened. I just told him that I was uncomfortable being there. That night, I had a dream that I was standing in the room. Everything was completely silent and black and white. It was sunny, just like it had been earlier. I woke up with my heart beating very fast, even though the dream wasn't scary. In the morning, I told my boyfriend what had happened, but he really wanted the apartment. We could take it. I was just being silly. I was with my boyfriend when he called the landlord. The conversation seemed casual, but at one point my boyfriend looked at me sharply. He hung up the phone and told me that the landlord said that since we were taking up the apartment, he was legally obliged to tell us that somebody died in that apartment. In my culture, if someone dies in a violent way, we should burn their clothes immediately. My uncle, who was a degenerate loser and predator, died in a fitting fashion. He was dragged by a car and thrown into a ditch. The coroner of the office released his clothes that he was wearing at the time. My uncle warned his sister and my mother and his wife not to look at them, but they got curious and wanted to see them. I followed them downstairs and they made me wait outside while they were snooping. While we were down there, we heard a smash upstairs. We ran upstairs to see a bunch of glasses that were shattered and nobody was in the house. My aunt and mother were spooked but didn't think much of it. Now this house was in the middle of nowhere. Our wakes are 24 hours long and somebody must always stay with the body. A family friend was leaving the wake and drove by the accident area. She seen what she was certain was my dead uncle, who smiled at her in a very unfitting way. We woke up the next morning, the last day of the wake, on one day before the funeral. My uncle was rattled, and I heard him tell my mother and aunt that he heard the crunching of boots on snow. My aunt and mother then come clean about what they did. My uncle said he warned them. They then started a fire and got rid of the body. He never bothered them again. From the ages of about 5 to 12, I lived in what I believe to be a haunted home. My first experience was when I was probably about 8 or so. I had just woken up as the sun was about to rise and my bed was directly next to the window. I sat up and peered out through the blinds. I then saw the glow from the sun starting to shine. I also saw what seemed to be maybe a 40-year-old man standing on the curb staring directly into my window. I was startled. I quickly pulled my head back away from the blinds. I sat there for about 10 seconds before I pulled the blinds slightly to the side to look again. This time, however, the man was about a foot away from my window. I screamed in pure horror and moved away from the window. My mother then come in, but no one was outside and the window was locked. The man looked slightly older and was wearing reading glasses. His complexion was white and translucent. He looked like a regular guy, but the second time that I saw him, his mouth was gaping wide, almost like he had a broken jaw. Now, a couple of years after I had my second experience, I walked out of my bedroom. This was during the night. I wanted to get a drink from the kitchen. The lounge room was in the centre and the kitchen was just off to the left. On the right side of the lounge was the front door. I walked down the hall to the entrance of the lounge room. My mother had left the light on during the night, so if any one of the kids woke up, they could move around easily. As I got to the entrance of the lounge room, I noticed that a figure was to the right of me near the door. It was a very tall woman who was walking towards me. I stood there frozen in fear as she walked past me. She went to grab something in the kitchen. She then turned around and walked straight past me and through the front door. As she did so, she did not take her eyes off me. She stared directly at me the whole time. She had the same complexion as the man. I could clearly see wrinkles on her face. She was very tall, maybe 7 foot tall. She had brown hair and a white gown on. I was fixated on her, and out of my peripheral vision, I could see what looked like a piece of paper that she'd taken from the kitchen. Now the way that she stared at me horrifies me even 20 years later. This was a sort of string of incidents that climaxed in one big thing that got all of us sent home for the day. First, the school that I went to was pretty old. It was built during the British occupation, and actually contained several secret exits and stuff. Certain parts of the school were permanently closed, which of course led to rumours among the students. My favourite was that a deformed kid lived there, forever shunned by the school. Second, we all witnessed a shaken, crying janitor being escorted out by some of the teachers. They were trying to calm her down. We were all told that she was ill, but the rumour was that she had seen something that she should never have seen in one of the stairwells near the locked area. Third, the ever popular toilet where all the boys went to secretly smoke. In the same week as the janitor's breakdown, there was a huge gathering at the toilet, and we saw teachers yelling at kids to go back to their classrooms. The toilet was then shut down. Why? There was a rumour that when one of the boys was coming out of there, he saw several wet long hairs plastered down on the wall. The grand finale. Somebody got possessed. One of the boys went into a frenzy and had to be held down. He was speaking in a very strange dialect that was quite alien to our area, and strangest of all, it was in a female voice. His parents had to be called as well as an ambulance, and we were all told to leave for the day. After that, the school got a priest to cleanse the whole school. I used to live in a haunted house. There was an old farmhouse in rural Norway that always had a reputation for being haunted. The house belonged to my ex-wife and her family. No one was staying there. It was her uncle's summer cottage, and we needed a place to stay, so we ended up using it. It was actually a very comfy place nestled in a valley. We brought our cat with us from America. When we moved there, I loved it. Everything was pretty normal for the first couple of months, but that's when the voices started. At first, they were indistinguishable, just muffled noises of females sulking. It was all stuff that was very easy to dismiss, but things got more intense. One night, the lights come on in the kitchen. We could smell food cooking, and there were women talking in there. Now, I should note that she had kind of a nosy family that would just show up whenever they felt like, but this was 3 in the morning. I was more angry than freaked out. I got up and headed towards the kitchen, and I started hearing voices. The voices stopped as soon as I entered the kitchen. I opened the door and went inside. The lights were still on, the oven was turned off but warm, the smell of food was in the air, and nobody was there. Things started to get more sinister after this. There were screams in the cellar and the attic, usually in the dead middle of the night, and the cat was getting increasingly agitated as time went on, acting like she could see things in the air that weren't actually there. This actually led us up to the event that made us move out of there. We woke up in the morning with the cat making this horrid howling, screaming sound in the living room. I go there to see what's happening and don't see her right away. It's then when I look to the side that I see her, still making this horrifying sound with her eyes glowing red. I then hear voices again. I tell my wife that we need to get out of here, and we left the next day. When my mum married my stepdad, we moved into his little brick house down in Texas. We were all getting along nicely. Me and my stepbrother were getting along well too. This relieved our parents, and we were pretty much happy. Except, I would start waking up in the middle of the night to see somebody standing in my doorway. All I could see was the silhouette of a large man with a large brimmed hat that would take up most of the doorway. It was so strange. I remembered it was all dark. All the lights in the house were off, yet somehow he stood out as a shadow. I could tell he was looking at me. He would even raise a finger to his mouth. I heard him go shh sometimes, and kind of let a little laugh out. It almost sounded like a scream. It's really hard to describe, but really eerie. It would never wake up my stepbrother though, and we shared a room, and he never remembered much of it. Anyway, I would always jump under the covers and hide, shaking, and just listen. I was sure that he was going to be right next to me. But nothing ever happened after that. I would never hear another sound. When I was brave enough to look out from under the sheets, the doorway would be clear, and I would lay awake for the rest of the night until the sun come up. Now this would happen to me at least once every 2 months, or sometimes once a month until we finally moved away a couple of years later. My stepdad and brother both swear that they never heard or saw anything unusual there, but my mum says that on some nights when my dad wasn't there, she would just feel somebody crawl into bed with her. She said that once, she felt the covers being pulled and jumped up and turned the light on, and nobody was there. I'm still not sure what it was to this day. I'm just thankful that it stayed in that home and never followed me any further. The house I grew up in, and my parents are in denial of its haunting, is what got me into the paranormal. So many things happened as I was growing up for the first few years of my life. I actually thought it as normal. Now before I get into the activity, I should provide some backstory. My father told my mum that something demonic was attached to him. He said one day while driving, he looked in his rearview mirror and he could see what he can only describe as a demon sitting in the car with him. He to this day will not describe what he saw, but he told her at the time that he felt really bad about it and he's always been running from it in a way. She firmly believes him, and we believe that he brought this entity into our home, and both her and I were targets of this. Now growing up, even my friends knew my home was haunted. Numerous people I had over would witness doors opening and closing. Every single one of them would feel incredibly uncomfortable in the basement. I remember me and my former best friend would tell my parents about a skeleton that lived in the basement. They thought this was just our imagination and would play it off as that. That's until they started becoming victims to whatever lived in our home also. Now my mum would have regular experiences with sleep paralysis, which in or of itself can be debunked, but not coupled with the most absurd and almost poltergeist activity with my personal accounts of what would happen to me. Not long after her first night of sleep paralysis, the alarm clock she kept by her bed would always fly off in the middle of the night and slam into the wall. I remembered hearing a woman screaming at the bottom of our stairs one night, and neither of my parents heard it. I was fully awake to this day and I still get chills thinking about it. Once I sat next to an unplugged fan and it turned on full blast. I would later learn as an adult that an old man had died in my parents' bedroom, which was a hotspot for this type of activity. Now hearing footsteps upstairs while my friends and I were in the basement was some of the most real and routine things that happened there. We actually called the police at least twice, believing that we're about to be robbed. I saw an apparition of a little girl and a cat sitting at my kitchen one day. I don't know how, but I somehow become instantly aware that the cat's name was Moonbeam, and from this day forward, on a regular basis, I would feel the cat jump up on my bed and rest on my feet, and I would always feel at peace during these times. Once when I was home, I felt a sharp pain like I'd been shot with a paintball gun. I was home alone at the time, and suddenly one of my dog's toys bounced away from me. I mean, something had actually thrown it at full speed towards my head. Now later that same night I was watching TV and it turned to white static. There was a big black X across the screen. I still believe it's plausible this was a cable glitch of some sort, but I've never had anything like this again. It was weird being paired with the other things from earlier. Now my parents at this time refused to believe me, and for my own protection that was. In reality, they were fully aware and having their own experiences, but didn't want to scare me. In protest, I set up my webcam to take pictures every few seconds while I went to school. And while no one was home, it captured a large red human-shaped face in the centre of the room. It was facing the camera. Even then, they refused to acknowledge it, but to this day, they remembered the incident. I remembered waking up in the middle of the night, suddenly hyper-aware that somebody was about to enter my room. I'd feel all of the hairs on my body stand on end, and I would hide under the covers until I felt their presence leave. This became a regular occurrence as I got older. As I became a teen and really started finding all these fascinating, I bought ghost hunting equipment and started using an old version of today's ghost box. And clear as day in the basement, I heard a deep voice call me by first and last name. Later I caught an EVP of 2 female voices talking, as if they could hear me, and wondered if I could hear them. I indeed heard the voices before, but couldn't place them. Now a lot of things have happened in that home, and I have many more stories to share. I still actively hunt ghosts and live very far from the house that I grew up in, but I'll never forget it.